Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Superhero Pantheon Redux. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find the Twitter for this podcast at Hero Pantheon. Once again, we are doing kind of a flashback as due to timing issues, we don't really have time to record new episodes this month. So last week, we uploaded older episodes that discussed Superman, the movie 1978, as well as Batman 1989. We are going back to the fourth and fifth episodes of this podcast as we discussed the 2000 X-Men, the original X-Men movie, and the 2008 Iron Man movie. Of course, my co-host for those shows, as well as now, is Brian at Brian to Brain on Twitter. And Brian, before we get into that discussion, who would have thought that Return of the Jedi would play so relevant over the course of these the last week?
Yeah, I know I joked about it last week, but when shit came down and the final votes had been tallied and people started dancing in the streets, I wasn't the only one thinking that because I saw a Twitter trend that had thousands of tweets, people thinking like, God, it feels like Return of the Jedi up in here, and people just posting these videos, and then put in the background music Return of the Jedi, whatever version you pick of Return of the Jedi's last 3 minutes of music, the changes from the '97 version. I prefer the later version, but whatever, Chumbawamba Chub Chub or whatever it is. But
I'm a fan of the original, and Brian is a fan of the new version. So we can't even get agreement on that on this podcast.
it's more of a music choice. I really, it was cool to see all the other planets and stuff like that, but I'm more about the music choice changes. But anyway, it was pretty remarkable to see. I feel like I did call it, but I call a lot of things. But looking back now, who would have called the fact that X-Men is on the Disney app right now?
It's pretty remarkable to think that X-Men is on the Disney app, the animated series, plus a number of the X-Men films, which you can go and watch at your leisure. And Bryan Singer is hopefully canceled in perpetuity. We never have to hear from him again.
Yeah, let's never mention him again. Well, maybe in a retrospective of what not to do, but that's years from now probably, and all the revelations will come out about him and what we've heard.
Maybe in a retrospective about how to not be a serial harasser. Maybe we could do that documentary. Harvey Weinstein, Bryan Singer, Kevin Spacey, a whole host of others.
As long as HBO doesn't stretch it out into multiple seasons for no reason at all, from what I've heard of these other documentaries that they're making. But yeah, on to better things. We also talk about Iron Man on this episode. We were talking about it off air. This is the first year without an MCU movie since '07, and it's nuts. It wasn't planned that way, obviously, but sometimes I don't know. Maybe the heart grows fonder. You know what I mean? When how do I miss you if you're not there? Kind of. I take that kind of approach with wrestling sometimes. Looking back at older wrestling when guys would leave for a while, but maybe in hindsight, this might be a good thing to build that interest again. Hopefully, WandaVision kicks things off for 2021 in a good way, and I have a good feeling it'll kind of launch things into the direction that the MCU needs to go with the multiverse and all that stuff, and introducing mutants if they have to at the end of it all. But I'm looking forward to it. Iron Man, looking back now, it's kind of an amazing journey considering all the shit that Robert Downey Jr. had to go through to get this role, and then the amount of money he made after getting this role, and then just 10 MCU movies later, I think, for the guy. It's unbelievable, his journey, and it's kind of his redemption. And then, looking at Jon Favreau as the guy that kind of godfathered it all. And now look at Jon Favreau now leading the Star Wars charge along with Dave Filoni.
Yeah, I think in some ways Robert Downey Jr. is as relevant to MCU's history as anyone else. He has no doubt made a lot of money. What is going to happen in his post-career, I'm not sure. Hopefully less Doolittle, and hopefully we get like good movies from him at some point. But Jon Favreau is as important of a creator in this space as anyone else, just by virtue of the fact that we do not have a set path for the Star Wars movie franchise. So The Mandalorian is kind of carrying the ball right now, and Jon Favreau, of course, is the writer, executive producer. He directed the first episode of the second season. He had a lot to do with the recent holiday special that aired on Disney Plus. So Jon Favreau is a very relevant person even to this day, and we discussed all of that and more on the episode where we discussed the 2008 Iron Man. Next week, there is going to be another Redux episode as we end November and approach Thanksgiving week. I'm not sure which episodes are going to go up, but we will figure that out over the course of the next 7 days. So, as always, make sure that you continue to support us. Leave a 5-star review. Make sure to give us feedback at Hero Pantheon. And stay safe. Wear a bleeping mask, for God's sakes. That's really all I have to say, Brian, before we go. Anything else?
Yeah, I mean the whole looking back thing, and I just can't believe we got Fox content on the Disney app now, and how much the world has changed in the last 2 years since we started this podcast in the early episodes. But um, if anything, man, it just shows you like maybe the strength and the power of the MCU and how it's maintained in this last year without any new content. Yet it still has the buzz on the internet, and everyone still talks about it. So, yeah, I think the MCU in 2021 is going to be really exciting, and just a lot of content. Because right now we were supposed to have Eternals by now, or at least probably I think it was supposed to come out on around this week, before the pandemic.
Yes, it was. We were supposed to have Black Widow. Black Widow should be on home video by now, and the Eternals should be in theaters. And unfortunately, in both of those cases, that's not going to happen. I get the feeling that Black Widow, in some form or fashion, is going to come out next year, whether that be on Disney Plus, whether it be through home video. I can't imagine Disney is going to be able to sit on Black Widow for an entire year. I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, me too. And then maybe hindsight, maybe this is better off in the chronological order of the MCU, because I was more interested in the WandaVision stuff anyway than Black Widow stuff. So
Yeah, I would agree. WandaVision's the thing that I'm most excited for. But enough chit chat. We will talk about WandaVision hopefully at some point. We will talk to you again next week. We will record a new intro for whatever the Redux is next week. So thank you very much. Enjoy our flashback back to the before time of January 2018.
I'm Professor Charles Xavier. I built this school where mutants could learn to focus their powers in a positive way, and also learn that mankind was not evil, just uninformed. You'll be safe here from Magneto, a very powerful mutant who believes that a war is brewing between mutants and the rest of humanity.
My co-host for this week and every week is Brian DeBrain, and fittingly, he can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. Brian, are you ready to talk about the X-Men?
Yeah, and after all, or out of all the movies of the X-Men series, this is the one I've seen the most, only because it's been on TV so many times in the last 20 years growing up. I saw this movie twice in theaters when it first came out. Not my intention to see it twice. It was just like I got invited a second time, and I was like, yeah, why not? Yeah, it definitely like stands out a lot to me in my head for like nostalgic reasons, but not because it's not a great movie. Let's get that right out of the way. It's not a great movie at all, but it's definitely had this like impact in my brain because A, it was the first X-Men movie, and B, it's something that I wanted as a kid for like ever since I watched the show. I wanted the X-Men movie, so I think that mixed in, it's like. It just really stands out for me a lot more than like X-Men 2, 3, and all that stuff. Even though X-Men 2 is probably the best of the first three, and Logan's probably better than all of them combined. But this kind of just has its, it has its moments kind of thing, and it's always going to have that special place in my mind just because of the place and time of it.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the things that's most notable about the X-Men movie, I would argue that it's important within the history of the superhero genre, given all of the X-Men movies that have followed it, given the fact that Marvel kind of decided that they needed to put everything in-house at a certain point. So I think the legacy of this film is very important, but I'm not sure if everything else is necessarily going to hold up as well. Just to give you some background on this, really Marvel has had a not-so-great history of films up until the point of the year 2000. We mentioned a few weeks ago Captain America from 1990 and the infamous Fantastic Four film that was produced but never really seen. So really, this is the second time that we are seeing a Marvel property that was sold off, because Marvel at one point was bankrupt. If you can believe that, Brian. Marvel at one point was very much in danger of just completely going away, and they were selling off some of their more famous properties, including X-Men, Spider-Man, the Hulk, Blade, Daredevil, and they were sold off. Then you would get some of these films, and Blade was kind of the first one. It was produced a couple years earlier. We will get into Blade at some point, but it was a moderate success, especially for something that was R-rated. So this was a huge opportunity. X-Men was one of Marvel's more popular properties. Part of that had to do with, obviously, the comics. Another part of that had to do with the very famous animated TV show that was on Fox Kids for a few years prior. And Brian, I know that you have probably very fuzzy feelings about that particular property as well.
Yeah, I can't wait for well, we mentioned it before, the Disney deal, but if they can just do that movie, like the version of the show into a movie, I think that's what I want. Not just me, but like all the fans, man. From the start, that's what we wanted. Those vivid, bright suits and the colors. God, I love the colors of the X-Men series. Like, their suits are so awesome. And that's what kind of like that visual look you kind of need in a movie like this. But they just went completely opposite with that with this movie.
They're all wearing leather suits. Not effective at all. The whole color scheme of this movie is very muted, and that is definitely going to hurt its score, in my view.
Yeah, we'll get into that later, but I blame The Matrix for that once we get to that part of it.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but that is a very good point on your part. So this movie was really only budgeted at about $75 million, and a couple of characters, including Nightcrawler and Beast, basically were cut from the original script, which, given how many characters there are in this movie, was probably not the worst thing. But it's funny because you basically have a lot of superhero godfathers of the past and the present and the future coming together for this movie, because on this film, Richard Donner and his wife both serve as producers of this film, and I believe I mentioned this a couple weeks ago. Richard Donner's wife continues to be a producer on all of the X-Men and Wolverine pictures up until this day in 2018. Kevin Feige served as an associate producer on this film. Joss Whedon wrote a draft, and of course you have Bryan Singer, who is the director of this, coming off of the success of The Usual Suspects. And Brian, unfortunately, we have to have the conversation about Bryan Singer. There have been a number of accusations surrounding him and some of his improprieties and some of his just absolutely disgusting behavior when it comes to issues of harassment and abuse. So that is something that, we unfortunately have to keep in mind as we are reviewing some of these superhero films, because Bryan Singer has a number of them in the X-Men franchise, and of course Superman Returns, and when we talk about some of the actors as well, this is something that we are going to have to address. But I'm not going to speak for you, Brian, but it goes without saying, Bryan Singer is a disgusting human being for the things that he has done, and if any positive things that we say about this film or X-Men 2 or any of the other X-Men movies, it should not be taken as a reflection of our views on him as a human being, because, what he has done, allegedly, is absolutely repulsive and is not something... I sincerely hope that he never directs a movie again, and he probably should not have been directing over the last few years as these accusations have become public.
Yeah, the thing is, I've heard about these going a while back. Like, I don't know, I've heard about them in college, and that was 2000. When did I hear about the stories? God, probably like when Origins came out, maybe 2009ish. He didn't even direct that; he was just the producer. But that's when I kind of heard about it, and then subsequent stories. I don't want to give details. It's alleged. You can go into it and research it yourself. But yeah, it's kind of a shocker that he's been able to direct still for the last 5-6 years since the stories broke out. But I think times are changing, obviously, and that is going to put a kibosh on that, hopefully. But like you mentioned, we're just going to, talk about his work and not the person itself. It's kind of like, watching Chris Benoit matches, going back to wrestling. So you kind of have to just separate that for what it is and, look at the artwork and kind of evaluate the artwork and not the person. So, yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on it. And kind of hate to say this, but Maybe the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was getting the Usual Suspects produced.
Yeah, I mean, it's extremely unfortunate. It's really hard to talk about, these movies because, I really like the X-Men franchise for the most part. There's certainly been some duds, but for me, the X-Men is probably one of the properties that I relate most to because of the fact that there is the animated series that I watched, and for a while I was reading the comic books, and I just really have a lot of connection to this. And yeah, it's really tough to talk about Bryan Singer because I have absolutely no respect for who he is. But we are going to talk about the importance of this film and kind of address it kind of aside from everything that Bryan Singer is and was associated. This is a very notable film because Hugh Jackman, this is his very first time playing Wolverine, as he then did about 9 more times, including all of the X-Men movies and 3 Wolverine films. Obviously, he had a small role in films like X-Men First Class and X-Men Apocalypse, but he has been such a huge part of this franchise, for better and for worse in some cases. But yes, I mean, we cannot talk about the X-Men franchise without talking about Hugh Jackman. And we're going to be saying a lot about Hugh Jackman and what he's done over the course of 17 years. But specifically, Brian, as we talk about him as one of the primary heroes of this film, what is your viewpoint of Hugh Jackman and his performance?
He's like the saving grace of these movies. Like, he is the star. He is the centerpiece to me. You needed a guy that can bring the character to life, because Wolverine is a hard character to bring to life. You got to be jacked. You got to be aggressive. You got to have this darkness to you. Wolverine has this darkness, man, that they kind of touched a little bit in this one, and they go further and further into, especially in X-Men 2 and Logan and all that. He's a dark character, man. He's done some things that he doesn't want to do. He was forced to do, but man, him bringing that to life, and the way that he, grows out his sideburns, like the Wolverine did in the show and the comic, and he basically brought it to life. The only thing that he probably could have put on maybe more, I don't want to say more weight, give it that like Rhino the wrestler kind of look. That's kind of like that short, stocky look. That's kind of how I pictured Wolverine, but Jackman kind of took it and made his own, and kind of he kind of got more jacked later on. They probably asked him to, because this is definitely the thinnest we're ever going to see Wolverine in the whole Hugh Jackman line of movies. But he really brought it to life and put so much care into the character and time and effort that he puts his body through. He knows that Wolverine made him who he is, and I know that he always wants to go back to the fans and always thank him for it. And I guess Logan, in the end, was kind of his his farewell, which he kind of wanted anyway, and it was a perfect farewell to the character. And I felt to me, Hugh Jackman is this X-Men franchise. Once he's gone, it's it's not the same franchise anymore. You might as well just make a new one. So I think we're at that point where now that he's gone, and we mentioned it a couple weeks ago on the first podcast, with this we could have our potential last X-Men franchise movie this year. And I think it should be it. And then we should just start fresh, because nothing is gonna, I don't know, despite all the continuity and stuff, without Hugh Jackman, it's done. You just got to start new. So that's the way I think of Hugh Jackman. I think he's just the star, more so than all the other characters. He's the only one to get an origin movie.
I think that is a huge problem with the franchise overall, is that they never really took the time to develop a lot of the other characters. I would argue that X-Men First Class went a long way in developing Professor Xavier and Magneto, but even then, you really didn't have that level of development like you have for Wolverine. Wolverine essentially gets 4 X-Men movies. He did a cameo in 2 others and 3 Wolverine movies, so there's a lot of story to be told there, and obviously so much of that impacts how we see a movie like Logan, and consider it to probably be one of the very best comic book movies ever made. But then you look at the rest of this cast, and you look at the way that the other characters are written, and it's really tough to evaluate Cyclops and Jean Grey, because they're not really characters. They're really important within the context of the X-Men in the comic. In the movies, Cyclops and Jean Grey are very much unimportant, and I think that's really unfortunate.
Storm gets it worse. She says nothing.
I mean, Halle
She
Berry,
says nothing at all.
Halle Berry has a really terrible accent that needs to be emphasized. I don't know. I think she's going for like this vague African accent that does not work at all. But there is no charisma. There is absolutely nothing there from Halle Berry on Storm. I don't know whether the problem is the casting or the writing. It's probably some combination of both. But Cyclops, Jean Grey, and Storm are three characters who really get almost nothing to do here. And, Rogue at least gets a little bit more. Anna Paquin is somebody who has, been in movies. She's one of the youngest nominated actresses of all time. She was on the TV show True Blood, so she certainly has a career. But once you get past the first half of this movie, Rogue is kind of playing the damsel in distress almost, and we really don't get a lot with her. And I think that's really unfortunate because I almost wonder if this is not a better movie if Rogue is the focus of it, and if Wolverine is kind of already implanted as an X-Men in some way, and you do small moments with Wolverine in the first one, and then the second one is where you more so do the big Wolverine movie, given that, the character is so much an integral part of the second movie, even more so. But Patrick Stewart at least gets a lot to do as he plays Charles Xavier. And one of the best scenes in the movie is Patrick Stewart just expositioning on what the X-Men are and all their powers and whatnot.
Classic. I love that scene a lot. There's
a lot of actors who could not pull that off, but Patrick Stewart does it marvelously.
I would go as far as to say that Patrick Stewart was more of a perfect casting than Wolverine. I mean, he was already bald, he already had the accent, and when I saw him, I was like, oh my god, like, this is Professor X. Like, they got Professor, like, I remember as a kid being like, oh my god, that's Professor X. He's already bald. And I knew he was from Star Trek, and I never watched Next Generation as a kid. I've seen this few episodes. I like the movies. I thought it was just like, wow, like, this is perfect. Like, they got it. And him, like, the way he carried himself and the way, like, he's the father figure to all the X-Men and he's their guiding light. And I think they got that down a lot. They got that down pretty well. Because that's, like, the vibe that I got from the show. And then recently I read a few of the comics, the Astonishing, I think it was Astonishing X-Men or something. It's very true to the character. Like, Patrick Stewart gets it, and he knows, like, at this point in Professor X's life, he's got to be there to be the teacher and lead them, and he's got to have the higher ground, he's got to have the higher moral ground, and I feel like you get that with him. But then, like you mentioned, like Jean Grey and Cyclops and Storm, they're just like nothing. I thought it was weird because, like, Cyclops was always, to me, like the leader of the group, and here he's so whiny and he's like not doing much, and he's just like, I feel like he gets in the way of things. And it felt like Jean Grey was more of the leader in this. I don't know how you feel about that, but she was the one who speaks to the Senate. She's the one who has to, like, help out with Cerebro eventually. You know what I mean? Like, she's more of, like, the central figure in the X-Men group as, like, leader.
I mean, they did a little bit of build up for the Phoenix in the first movie as well. There was a little bit of Phoenix that could be seen. So clearly they knew what they had in mind for Jean Grey by the third movie. Even at this Grey, at least you get some dialogue. You have this really creepy relationship with Wolverine that I don't believe it ever really worked. And yeah, Cyclops just not written very well at all. Let's talk about the villains. I particularly want to hear your thoughts on Ian McKellen's casting as a Magneto, because I really like Ian McKellen, and I think he has some good moments here, but overall, I was never really impressed with him as Magneto. I always felt like he was a little bit too old to be Magneto.
Yeah, I got that vibe too. But then I recently watched parts of an interview he did, and he said the reason that he was so wanted to be Magneto is because he's a gay person, and as a gay person, he relates to the whole, like, outcasting and, like, because basically we kind of forget to mention that the X-Men were created during the Civil Rights Movement, and it's kind of like this representation of the Civil Rights Movement, like, for the comics, right? For Stan Lee, he wanted to, like, bring that to the comics, and so he brought the X-Men, who were these people that were, mutants, and they're, they're kind of exiled from society, and they're kind of like, they don't want, like, society was kind of turning their backs against them, and they just wanted to be part of society themselves, very much like the Civil Rights Movement. So, and then it kind of reflects into this, basically. We kind of have to mention that, I feel.
Absolutely, and the dynamic that was always mentioned by Stan Lee is that Professor Xavier Xavier was the equivalent to a Martin Luther King, and Magneto was the equivalent to a Malcolm X, and sort of the different philosophies that accompanied what it meant to be those two civil rights leaders. Professor Xavier was very much into non-violence and trying to negotiate some sort of a peace with humanity and Homo sapiens, and Magneto's idea was that there was a war coming, and that ultimately it was going to have to be mutants that have to take the initiative and basically eliminate humans from existence. So you kind of have those warring philosophies, and obviously because Bryan Singer is gay, you also have kind of that play into this movie as well. I think one of the unfortunate aspects of this franchise is that, we really don't get a lot of female or characters of color are not emphasized all that much, and I think that is a huge weakness for a franchise that purports to be something that is about these issues. They don't really do a good job of showcasing, Jean Grey and Storm and Rogue are kind of put to the sidelines, and there are very few actors of color that are in any of these movies. And when we talk about one of the characters in X-Men First Class, it's going to be probably rock bottom for the franchise, I would say, as far as doing that. Yeah, I mean, I think that the franchise as a whole does not do a lot of the characters justice.
Yeah, I get that vibe too, and especially with Halle Berry being the only female black actress in the movie, and then having this be about being rejected by society and that kind of thing, and just the way that black people were treated in the 60s, and then having this whole pseudo civil rights movement theme kind of going on, and yet she does nothing in the movie.
She's almost silent, which is hilariously ironic.
Yeah, for sure.
So when we talk about the villains, we are also talking about Mystique, Toad, and Sabretooth, who get very little to do. That's kind of the theme that we've been discussing. Mystique probably gets the most to do. She is an important character in this franchise. Brian, you may be more familiar with the comic than me, but it seems like even aside from the fact that Jennifer Lawrence was Mystique and they felt obligated to give her a whole lot to do, but it seems like even in these movies, Mystique is a much more important character than she ever was in the comics.
Well, I didn't read as much as the comics, but in the show, she's definitely more important in the movie than she was in the show. The show, she would just kind of show up and be a foil to someone's plan or something. And I remember at the time, the big complaint I heard from, the people that did read the comic books was that she's supposed to be Nightcrawler's mom, right?
Yes.
And then in X-Men 2, Nightcrawler shows up as, something completely different. You didn't stick to the comics. And then, of course, that's just fanboys being fanboys, whatever.
That's fine. I mean, that really doesn't...
Yeah. But this is it's kind of weird because I guess they didn't have lead female characters, and they did have the Jean Grey getting more dialogue. Yeah, she was the counter Jean Grey, I guess, in this movie.
What they also have to do in all of these X-Men movies is find a way to neutralize Professor Xavier's powers, and they found a way to do it in every single movie that he's in.
Yeah.
The first one, it's Cerebro that takes him out. Mystique poisons Cerebro, and Professor Xavier is basically laid up for much of the third act of the film, and the rest of the X-Men are the one that have to go and make the save. And Xavier is basically in a hospital.
That's kind of the thing in all of them, right? They either have to kidnap Professor X, like they did in X2, X3, they just killed him off 2/3 of the end of the movie, because he's definitely they even mentioned in Logan, Professor X, is the strongest mutant out of all of them?
Yes.
I guess, technically? Because he can kill all of them in a second.
They keep the running gag going even up until Logan.
Which is kind of smart. I mean, you would think all these different ways that he can just probably win the day because he's so powerful, yet they don't allow him to do it. So, here's what it is.
I mean, you almost have to, otherwise there's really no story to tell. Toad, something in Jean Grey's face, and that's the only useful thing I feel like he does.
Toad sucked, dude. Toad sucked. I hated Toad.
In the movie, or just in general, you don't like?
In the movie, I don't even remember Toad in the show. Honestly, he was so minor. They could have got other characters. I guess I don't know.
Part of X-Men Evolution, I do remember that.
Oh well, okay, X-Men Evolution, yeah. But in the original
animated series, no. He was not.
Yeah, it was just, he was not even that important. Sabretooth, I thought, was a letdown.
Letdown. They baned him.
And then they retconned him. They had to retcon him to fix him. Small side note that the guy who played Sabretooth was a wrestler. I forget his name. I think his name was Big Titan or some
Tyler
shit like
Bane.
that.
I think his real name is Tyler Bane, and yeah, he was.
He was in New Japan, for Christ's sake, I think.
Yes.
Jesus. But yeah, I actually met him once, surprisingly, in Reseda at the Legion Hall in 2001, right after the movie came out. He was there for a wrestling show there, and he was in that VIP section, where they have that curtain, and there's that table behind the curtain, that round table. Before there was no curtain, it was just the VIP section, and that's where I saw Sabretooth. So there you go.
He gets almost nothing to do, says nothing, gets into a couple fights, and is overall he's useless. I mean, it was actually shocking to see him dominate Wolverine at the end of this movie, because up until this point, he had just been completely obliterated, like multiple times. It was just a fool and a foil.
Yeah, he's definitely like Mongo. That's a reference for Mel Brooks fans out there.
Right. And of course, there is Senator Kelly, who gets killed.
God, that so confused me as a kid. When you watched that, didn't you think, oh, he's just going to come back as like a water creature or something?
I just thought the idea of killing Senator Kelly in the first movie was so stupid.
Yeah.
Why would you take that bullet out of the chamber? I mean, this is somebody who can be a consistent character for all of the movies as kind of the human voice of anti-mutant hysteria, and you basically just take him away right away. I
thought that was going to be good. Yeah, and especially like he's got this legacy in the X-Men series of being like one of the main non-mutant villains, I guess you'd call him, right?
Yes.
Him, maybe like Trask. It just feels like, why? Why did you kill him off randomly in the middle of a sentence?
Yes.
Like in the middle of a sentence,
turn him into a mutant and then kill him.
Mid-sentence. It was
no
weird.
idea what the mutation was. Always very confusing to me, and I still can't quite figure.
Yeah. So were they all just gonna? If okay, hypothetically, spoiler to everybody, the movie's been out for 18 years. If Magneto would have carried out his plan, everyone would have just turned into water creatures eventually or something and just melted?
I guess. I mean, the story of this movie is not... It's actually simple and straightforward. I will say that. I do like the twist that everybody thinks that they're going after Wolverine, but instead it's Rogue that they're actually going after.
That was good. That was good.
But, I mean, the plot is pretty forgettable.
Yeah, I mean, I forget what the machine's even called. I don't even know. Yeah, wasn't it going to kill Magneto if he held on too long?
Magneto would have had to use all of his energy to... He basically would have had to pull Luke Skywalker from the end of Last Jedi.
I was about to say, yeah, all of his energy and then evaporate into
die, but instead he was transferring his power to Rogue. Rogue was going to use the powers, and...
I do like that Rogue, they explained the Rogue's hair thing with that, and that was cool. I thought that was like, oh, the hair!
Yeah, that
was like a mark up. That's one of those things for the marks, though. Like, we'll give him this.
So yeah, Brian, I would say that the plot of this film is pretty nondescript. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. And I did appreciate the fact that it was only an hour and 45 minutes, whereas it feels like so many of these superhero movies now are over 2 hours, 2 hours 20, 2 hours and 30 minutes. So at least this movie got in and out very quickly. But there really isn't a whole lot to talk about when it comes to the actual story, because it's a pretty straightforward... It feels more like an episode of a TV show than a movie.
I was going to say the exact same thing, because nothing... Like, the consequences are not really... We had more consequences at the ending of X2, for sure. Like, what was going to happen. Like, maybe they should have killed off Jean in this one and then bring her back in the third one, maybe, and leave her completely out of X2. That would have been a little interesting. I don't know, something like that. Just to kind of, like... I don't know, X-Men 1 has, like, almost no significance, it feels like.
It's
other than its legacy.
5-minute prologue. I mean, that's what it feels like. X2...
Yeah, that's what it does feel like.
X2 is really the first X-Men movie. And I've always believed that X-Men does not work as a film franchise because there are way too many characters to try to get across. And I truly believe that if X-Men was a TV show, a live-action TV show, with really high production values... that would be the best thing for everyone involved. And I'm not talking about The Gifted. I'm talking about like a real X-Men, whether it's streaming or on Netflix.
Yeah, I've been wanting that for so long. I kind of pictured that when they talked about that X-Men show, and then they turned it into The Gifted, and I was just like, I don't care. Like, no one cares about that. Give us what the fans want. Give us the suits. Give us, like, the characters. Give us, like, the storylines from the show and translate it from the animated show. Like, that's the money. Like, the money's in the animated show. And a lot of the producers, I don't think, get that. And then...
I mean, I don't even necessarily know if it's in the animated show, but I think it's with that concept. I think it's with having a group of characters that you care about. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to encompass Wolverine, but I think that if you look at not just the original animated series, but if you watch X-Men Evolution and even Wolverine and the X-Men, those two shows were actually much better done than a lot of the X-Men movies were, too.
Yeah, and that was what X-Men and Wolverine and the X-Men. That was so limited. That was like a 2-season run.
Yeah, they did not have a very long run, but that was a very well done show. I would even say, people are very nostalgic for the original. I would say Wolverine and the X-Men was a better animated show.
Really?
Than the original. Yes.
Wow, that's saying a lot. Because I remember watching that, I was like, wow, I've never seen Wolverine in this like central role where he's not out for himself. He's like guiding people and being like the Professor X. It was kind of weird, but it was like a new, fresh take. That's what I got from it. But I can see what you're saying in terms of that. I think people want, this is my thing, I think people want that feeling that the show gave them. They just haven't figured out how to translate that yet, but I think if you give like MCU that property, they can give us that feeling again. Look at Guardians, right? If you look at Guardians, you had to introduce 5 characters, right? And they got it done. Here, you could have just introduced 5 of the X-Men, and that was it, and give them some kind of like context or whatever. Or maybe it was just them having their first mission or something. But it just feels like they could have done a lot more with the characters coming together, and instead of just focusing on one, and then it goes all over the place.
For sure. And when we talk about the visuals, this is a very dark movie. Not in the literal sense. I mean, there's definitely some comedy, and this doesn't feel too heavy, but man, this movie is just so muted all the time. There's a lot of blues.
And a lot of gray.
A lot of silvers. It's just very visually uninteresting, and I know that this is the year 2000, but there's just nothing to this. And this is a pretty drab color scheme, and that is also reflected in the uniforms as well. There's even a joke made by Cyclops about asking Wolverine whether he would rather wear yellow spandex, and I was like, I mean, it's better than what you're wearing now.
Give me the yellow spandex. Yeah, I know that exact line. I've had that exact same reaction whenever I hear that line. Yeah, give me the fucking yellow and blue spandex, man, with the horn.
I will even accept the brown and orange uniform.
Oh, God. Yeah, I know what you mean. But at least First Class like picked up on that, and they gave us those 60s bright yellow suits. At least I give Matthew Vaughn, I think, gets it, but I don't think he's coming back to the X-Men franchise.
Even Magneto's costume, if you look at Magneto's costume in this film versus X-Men Days of a Future Past, it's much more colorful. And I know that probably shouldn't matter. It's a comic book. I mean, it's supposed to be something that is visually interesting and visually engaging. And I think the problem with a lot of these comic book movies, and I'm particularly calling out a lot of the MCU movies, is a lot of them don't seem to have a very particular visual style. I think they're starting to do a better job of it in recent movies, but when you have a comic book movie like this, you really have to have a very clear scheme and have something that is visually interesting to look at.
Yeah, you look at Guardians, and they took the complete opposite approach, They brightened everything up in space, and they made everything look like borderline Technicolor on some of the scenes. And here, everything is like you said, muted down. And compared to the show, everything was so like colorful and bright. But I think because The Matrix was such a big thing in '99, that I think they felt like, oh, this is what the people want now, so we got to dress them up like a dude from The Matrix. And that's kind of what the vibe I got the whole time. Every time I see these suits, I hate them. It just makes me think of The Matrix. And Matrix is good on its own kind of thing, but man, these suits are just like so thoughtless and like so plain, and it feels like they almost abandoned the suits right by the third one, or they kind of just no, they didn't actually. When I think about it, some of the newer ones, I think Ellen Page,
the whole trilogy, basically.
Yeah, it sucks.
And I hope you like blue and gray and white, because we get a lot more of that in X-Men 2.
Yes, especially with the snow and all that shit and the silver machinery kind of vibe going on. Yeah, for sure. That's definitely a weakness, I think, in these movies, because like the whole aspect and the appeal is like brightness and vivid and colorful. I don't know why they took that out. Like, I guess The Matrix was just such a big thing that it's like, man, we gotta dress them up in like tight gray, black-ish, suits that are not really visually appealing.
So obviously that is one of the legacies of this film, is that we have these wonderful leather suits that nobody likes. But it did give Marvel some momentum. This was a financial box office success mostly because of the fact that you're finally putting the X-Men on the screen. And even though the story is pretty nondescript, there are definitely some positive elements. You do have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. You have Patrick Stewart as Professor Xavier. I think this movie is generally watchable, but it's also very forgettable. But ultimately, when we look at the positives, it has spawned an entire franchise, and I think it really gave Marvel the confidence that these movies are going to be a really important aspect of their business model for the next century. And not getting away from the comic books, but kind of expanding their brand, so to speak, was going to be really important. And I think those are all of the things that I think this movie does for as far as legacy goes.
Yeah, without the success of this, wow, where would we be at? We would have no MCU, right? Like no MCU.
It'd be really hard to see an MCU without this, and I think that Marvel desperately needed a success like this, even though they're not directly benefiting from X-Men's success. Indirectly, I think this starts to get the wheels turning on a potential cinematic universe for them, and it would take another 10 years or so for that to fully develop with Iron Man, but selling off your properties only gets you so far. I mean, at this point, because of what they've been able to do with the MCU, Marvel's is a real powerhouse, and they have a lot of influence and a lot of power within the industry, and we can debate whether that's a positive or negative, but the fact is that the MCU is what's really driving a lot of the ticket sales now.
Yeah, absolutely. They had 3 of the top grossing movies in 2017.
We're not even talking about their A franchise. I mean, again, we're not talking about the X-Men. We're not really talking about even Iron Man. We are talking about Guardians of the Galaxy, Thor 3, and Spider-Man Homecoming. And Spider-Man Homecoming was going to have some real struggles because of the previous 2 films not being very well regarded.
Yeah, they took, a franchise in Thor that people kind of gave up on after, Thor 2.
Gave up, I think, is the wrong word for that. I think people were, I would say, unenthused about the franchise at best.
I didn't think we were going to get a third Thor movie, actually, to be honest. I thought they were just going to do, they're going to find out that Loki's still owed, and then Loki's going to have to be, taken out in the next Avengers movie or something. I really thought they were not going to do a third Thor movie.
I thought the second one was successful enough to where they would do a third one. I think they knew, though, that the second one didn't work.
For sure. But yeah, you can't have these kind of successes without X-Men. So it all kind of ties in back to that. It's in terms of legacy, it all starts it doesn't start with X-Men, but for Marvel in general, more importantly, Marvel, this is their first big success. And then after that, they would, go on to do Spider-Man, which would kind of elevate their confidence even more.
20th Century Fox was behind the X-Men franchise, and obviously Sony was behind the very first Spider-Man movie.
Yeah, and do you think Spider-Man would be as big if it wasn't for X-Men?
I think if Spider-Man had come out first, I don't think the X-Men had any influence on Spider-Man. I think Spider-Man was a very popular character independent of the X-Men.
Interesting.
I think a lot of what drove Spider-Man's success is the fact that I think Tobey Maguire was a very popular actor at that point. I think people were really interested in his success. I think film geeks really like Sam Raimi. I think that's part of what drove it. And I think you just had a really crowd-pleasing romance with Kirsten Dunst and Tobey Maguire. I think that's what made that film successful. What I think made the X-Men successful, I think part of it was nostalgia for the animated series, but I also think bringing in Patrick Stewart helped. You had a director who, from a film perspective, had some credibility. You had Ian McKellen in there, and you really just had a bunch of unknowns, but I think Hugh Jackman really jumped off the screen right from the start.
Yeah, I for sure agree on that one.
Let's get to the burning questions. Who is the MVP of this film?
I gotta say co-MVP, because looking at this now, it's Patrick Stewart just made the show almost real to me. Seeing him the way he talked and the way with the accent, and he was already bald and he carried himself and he was in the wheelchair that really gets to me, man. Especially now when I watched Logan earlier in the year, it really comes full circle with that for me, because those were the 2 characters that really carried it for me. And of course the other one I'm talking about is Wolverine. Those are the 2 MVPs for me. And I love how in Logan they go back to that, like that core relationship those two have, and they touch on like that relationship starts here, and something about Patrick Stewart, man, just like the way he carries himself as Xavier, he breathes life into that character, and he he cares about that character. You can tell, like he really puts his all, and then it becomes this big payoff with the character in Logan. So those are my two MVPs.
The Wolverine-Xavier dynamic is something that plays out over all of the movies, and it's something that we're definitely going to be focusing on. Even X-Men Days of a Future Past, that is a relationship that is very important to that film as well. I would say I think Patrick Stewart is really the MVP of the first movie. I'm not going to cop out and say two people. I'm really going to say that it's Patrick Stewart. I think he really has to carry a lot of the exposition load, and that is not always something that's easy, and there are not a lot of actors who can successfully do what he did. And I think for this first movie, you really needed Patrick Stewart, especially in the first half, to really make this into something special. But what does it say that there are really only two contenders? I mean, I feel like the X-Men should have like 10 contenders with all the quality of these characters, and we have two.
Well, Magneto, I think he gets it. I think, but we get more into that Magneto character once we get the Michael Fassbender interpretation,
right.
and we
Michael
get really
Fassbender
into that.
It was a fantastic casting decision.
Yeah, he's the best Magneto, for sure. That leads to the burning question number 2. Was Ian McKellen the best choice? Man, that's tough, because I can picture Jeremy Irons. I can picture Liam Neeson. I think, Ewan McGregor was too young at the time. Somewhere around there, but it did give you this idea that, man, there is this history there, because Ian McKellen was so old going into it. And Patrick Stewart, I mean, you can barely tell with Patrick Stewart being, bald and shaving his head, but it makes it seem like there's this long-standing history there. And we got to talk about that scene in the beginning. To me, that scene in the beginning is that sets the tone of what it should be about, this whole series. And we're talking about that scene where Magneto's separated from his parents at that concentration camp. And then all of a sudden you start seeing the gate move and he doesn't realize what he's doing. And then they go back to that in First Class. I thought that was brilliant.
I think it works much better in First Class.
Yeah.
I mean, hindsight is 20/20 in a situation like this. I don't necessarily know if it works in this movie, but in First Class, it is 100% appropriate and
absolutely
totally made sense in the context of that film. I'm not sure if it was as effective in this one.
Yeah, best choice, I don't know, because I can easily see, like I said, Liam Neeson stepping in, and because he's got that size too. The thing with Ian McKellen is he kind of loses that size if you kind of compare, if you want to believe into the fact that he was Michael Fassbender looking at some point, right? But he does lose the size. But that would have been a little more believable, I think, with Liam Neeson. But yeah, was he the best? I don't know. I don't think so. Looking back now, I think he's the best choice to play an older Magneto for sure. But
yes.
But a 50-year-old Magneto, I don't know.
Absolutely. How much better of an ensemble is this film if Stormer and Cyclops are written and performed better? And specifically what I'm getting at is, do you think it's the writing or the performances that are the problem?
Oh, it's the writing. Cyclops is just not Cyclops. He's not the leader that he should be. Cyclops was always the leader of the X-Men. And despite how much he argued with Wolverine and stuff, they followed his, he was the Captain America of the X-Men, right? That's what Cyclops should be, the leader, the tactical leader. But they just made him look like a jock in this one, I think. You never really get that Cyclops ever. The Cyclops that I referred to, the one from the comic and the show. You never really get that in any of these movies at all. He's just
complaining. He's still the leader.
Even in the show, the whining wasn't even that thing. He was just pissed at Wolverine for trying to get at his girl. And they do that here, but it comes off like this high school shit that doesn't really, in the hindsight of it all, it does play to the Logan character because that's one of his driving forces towards the end in his later movies. And I get that. But the way that Scott Summers is just portrayed, it's so...
James Marsden was not the right choice to cast. I think that's part of the problem.
And it's not like he's a bad actor, because for certain roles he's good. He's good in that Prince role. And what was that? The Amy Adams princess movie? Enchanted?
Yes.
Yeah, he was good at that.
He's also very good in Westworld too.
Ooh, I've not seen any season 1 of Westworld yet, so it's on my list.
Yeah, he's very good in that. I mean, I don't think he's any good in the superhero genre. Because he wasn't very good in Superman Returns either.
Yeah, that was okay. This was 18 years ago. Sometimes it just takes some time for these guys to get to a certain level. Like Brad Pitt sucked in the 90s. Let's just say it now, and then it took him a while, and then he got good. So it happens, and James Marsden was very young at the time. Man, a lot of this cast still looks the same, which is kind of crazy. 18 years later. James Marsden, he looks the same. Hugh Jackman kind of looks the same, obviously. Patrick Stewart looks the same because he's still bald and, whatever. Ian McKellen shows his wear and tear now. But yeah, this cast kind of holds the test of time.
Still looks good, too.
She does. I don't know. It was weird because in one of the interviews, she said, she likes having this central role or something, how she's kind of in the background, quote unquote, and just kind of there. She's like, I don't have to worry about whatever. And then in the later movie, she's complaining about not having enough screen time. You know what I mean? It's like.
So when you say the mutacolor scheme hurts the overall visuals of the film?
That's one of my biggest things is the suit's just terrible. It's so fucking terrible. I don't mind the special effects they use because I really like the scene on the train. Where Magneto's bending him back with the metal and the claws. I love that scene a lot. It's more like old school movie magic kind of thing. You know what I mean? Not really a lot of CGI. It's just you got to lift the guy up and then you got to forcibly do some things with the metal and the claw. That's kind of practical effect kind of thing. I like that. But then some of the CGI at the end was kind of weird. I don't know why the machine that they're using has all this white glow coming out of it. I don't understand that. I think that was just a visual choice, I guess, or they just ran out of money. But some of it was kind of weird, and then some of it was kind of cheap. If you look at the fight scenes in this compared to X2, completely different.
Absolutely. And would the X-Men function better as a TV show?
Oh, God, yes. I've been saying this for so long. They should just do a live action show. You don't have to give us all the characters every week. Obviously, we're on a budget, but if you look at what Flash and Arrow and Supergirl and what they've been able to do, Legends of Tomorrow even, that's pretty much an X-Men right there without the whole, context of the social injustice and, social war kind of going on, right? It's just a group of guys coming together and having adventures, right? That's kind of sort of like X-Men, but if you just mix in with some better writing, you can incorporate that and you can get that. It's possible to do this as a show nowadays. I don't know why that they have to do, we have to tell this story about some random family. We have to tell the story of Magneto's son. We have to tell this story about this nobody. That's not what people want. Just give us what we want. It's not that hard.
It's the same thing with there's a Krypton prequel that's going to be on the Sci-Fi Network.
Yeah, don't get me started.
You want to talk about a show that nobody will possibly care about.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know if it's tone deaf. I don't know if it's just producers trying to make a quick buck. This is definitely a show material kind of thing. I can see this on HBO and getting in a darker tone and getting some extra money. I could see Netflix going after this and be you know what, why don't we try it?
Disney, I'll tell you what, Disney has a streaming service coming in 2019.
Yeah, I was about to mention that, and I would rather see X-Men as a show like a Daredevil, like a Luke Cage kind of show. Yeah,
more episodic.
More episodic, more writing. That way you get to develop these characters more. You can still have your edginess to it with because Netflix, you can do whatever you want, obviously, right? Or the streaming services.
If you want, you can do whatever you want.
You can do whatever you want. So you can just have this show and have it be what the fans want, and you can still incorporate it into. You can make its own universe if you want to. You can tie it in with the MCU if you want to. There's a lot of options on the table because it's just if it was one X-Men, right, and the whole focus was on Wolverine the whole time, then yeah, it's a movie. But because of all these characters and all these stories, it's just so much to tell. Maybe even go as far as make a movie eventually, but do a show first. People have tried that. I know Dark Tower tried that and just failed miserably. You put some thought into it, you can connect them together. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I think, low-key is one of the better, smarter decisions that Marvel's been made. You know what I mean? To put that show on the air, to give the context and the filler for the fans that are just diehards, that are just trying to get their Marvel fill and connect all the dots, that's perfect for that.
But even Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., I think, took too long to develop, and I think a lot of people gave up on it.
I gave up on it. I'm not going to lie, I gave up on it, but at least, it's a concept that you can connect a show to a movie universe, and it's very possible to do that, and X-Men can easily do that, but they just want to make it complicated for some reason. Like, I think I don't know if you've seen the trailer for New Mutants. I think it's just a bad idea. Like,
It's a horror movie, right?
yeah, no one wants an X-Men horror movie. They want the X-Men. No one wants like these horror like.
I think that they are trying to experiment with different genres. Just as Deadpool was more of a comedy, Logan was a western. I think Fox is trying to, because Marvel is Marvel, and you're not going to out-Marvel them. I think they're trying to see what works and what doesn't, and I think there is the potential for New Mutants to work as a horror movie. I mean, I think a comic book movie can work in any genre. It just depends on who the director is, how well it's written. If you were to tell me that there was going to be a Deadpool movie starring Ryan Reynolds after the 3 previous Ryan Reynolds movies I saw, I would have said, that's not going to work. But you have the right director, you have the right writer, you have the right supporting cast, and Deadpool's really good. It's the same thing with Logan. James Mangold is the same director. He also directed the second Wolverine movie, which I don't think was that great. He also directed Hugh Jackman in Kate and Leopold, which is not a great movie. But he also directed him in Logan because, he got to do what he wanted. There was a better script. So I think it just depends. I think it can work.
I don't know. I think it could work if it's characters that we're familiar with, but they're just throwing this at us with like new random characters, and to me it's just like, I'm not going to see this. I don't think I'm going to see that movie. I just have no connection to it.
I would also be curious to know what the budget is for that movie, because if it's cheaply budgeted, then it really is just them experimenting with a different genre.
I get that. I totally get that. And especially with a movie like, I think Get Out kind of like was like, we're going to put this movie together, we're going to release it, we have no budget. And then they were like, oh, you can make movies off of, no budget movies nowadays. People forget that. I think producers in Hollywood have forgotten that notion. As you can still make...
I mean, we could have an entire conversation, but Blumhouse basically will let a director do whatever they want for $5 million or less, and what happens is you get Split, you Get Out, and you also get a host of other horror genre movies that they have helped produce, and I think Universal does the distribution.
Yeah, so it's possible. I mean, they can make money on this for sure, and they're going to make their quick buck, but New Mutants, I don't know. And then we talked about possibly the last X-Men movie, right? The Dark Phoenix. I think that we're at the end of this universe as a whole coming up at the end of the year, I'm hoping. And we can just start fresh, and we either get a show or we get a movie that, that the director gets. And they got to pick a director that, I don't know, maybe Matthew Vaughn gets him more than any of the X-Men directors, I think. Maybe even more than James Mangold, because that Logan is more of like a Western last ride of the gunslinger kind of movie to me, right?
Right.
More so than anything. It would
be very difficult to bring James Mangold back.
Yeah. So I think Matthew Vaughn is the guy, and you just got to give him the rights, and you got to tell him, hey, we want the colors, we want everything from the 90s, either a show or a movie, go. And that's what they need to do, I think.
I mean, I think you have to look at what Marvel's done, and you have to try to do something different. And I think doing something different means doing a TV show. I think that's the only, because, like I said, they've got the formula down, and it's going to be really difficult to try to counter that with anything except being different. And if that means trying to look at different genres, even, I think that's where success is coming from. Well, we have completely fallen off the rails here. We're not even talking about the original X-Men, and that probably says a lot about the quality and the forgettability of this film. So let's talk about our scores. So for Heroes, I gave X-Men a 7.
Same with me, 7 on that one.
Villains, I gave it a 6.
Villains, I gave a 7 only because Ian McKellen gets it. Like, he gets the heart of that character.
Story, I gave it a 7, and I feel like that's a little high, but...
Yeah, I'm giving a 6 on that one.
Understandable. Visuals, I gave it a 6.
That's tough, man, because as bad as I hate the suits, I do like the look of Mystique, man. Like, really, they got that down. So I go with a 6.
I actually like the design of Cerebro in the mansion, too, and that's probably one of the reasons I'm giving it a 6. I also like the design of the claws. Actually, the first half hour of this movie, the visuals are actually pretty good. with Wolverine in the cage at first, and then they go in the car in the snow. I think that the first half hour of this is pretty good.
Yeah, I can see that. I didn't like the way that they looked at the Senate, though. God, the Senate looked bad too.
Not good. That it didn't look like the Senate.
Yeah, it had its own weird look to it too.
On Legacy, I gave this an 8.
Same with me. Legacy definitely an 8 because, like I said, it was the first X-Men movie. That was what brought people to the dance. It brought me to the dance. I went and saw this movie twice, even though I knew it wasn't like an amazing experience. I just wanted to see the X-Men on screen, and that's the legacy of it.
All right, my total score is 34. So for me, this does not make the cut.
Yeah, 34 here too, so that's kind of what I guessed, around the 60s that this would get overall, 68.
68, which I think makes sense. I think this is... I have very little problem with this getting a 68 and missing... I mean, this missed it by a lot, actually.
Yeah, this was no way going in the upper echelon.
I think this is more important with hindsight than it actually is as an individualized production.
Yeah, it's not great. Let's just say that. It's decent. And it's a good movie to watch on TV when you got nothing to do.
And it's clear by the fact that we spent a lot of our time not talking about the actual movie. But next week...
But yeah, it's part of it. It's part of it. The legacy, so...
Mr. Stark, you've been called the Da Vinci of our time. What do you say to that?
Absolutely ridiculous. I don't paint.
What do you say to your other nickname, the Merchant of Death?
That's not bad.
They say the best weapon is one you never have to fire. I prefer the weapon you only need to fire once. That's how Dad did it. That's how America does it. And it's worked out pretty well so far. To peace.
My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain, and he can be found on Twitter, fittingly, at Brian DeBrain. This week, Brian, we are taking a look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is our first MCU movie. And I know that this is one that has been anticipated by both of us, as this is really the start of something special.
Yeah, it's pretty iconic, especially the last scene, because I think, as crazy it is, as all the scenes, in this movie, and there are a lot of great scenes, I think the most memorable one is the after credit scene, and it sets this tone, you know what I mean? Like, that's the most memorable scene. It sets up the universe, I think. Right from then on, everyone's, staying after the credits for Marvel movies now and all that kind of thing. So not only this movie has a legacy for it because of what it started and, the cultural shift in movies and the way we watch movies, but it's just started it all 10 years ago. Holy shit. I remember going in thinking man, I mean, I couldn't believe A, that they were doing an Iron Man movie, and B, that Robert Downey Jr.? Like, what? We can go into his career in a second, but at this time, 2008, no one really wanted to invest in Robert Downey Jr. unless it's like a small budget kind of thing, right?
No, I believe that Terrence Howard was actually was making more money than him. I believe Gwyneth Paltrow made more money than him, and 10 years later, it is almost impossible to think of a Marvel Cinematic Universe without Robert Downey Jr. He is somebody who has always gotten a lot of credit and publicity for being a great actor over the years. He has had a tremendous career, and he ran into a lot of personal problems, a lot of personal demons, dealing with a drug habit. There was a time when he was on the Ally McBeal show and he got fired. I mean, this is a guy who, my earlier memories of him are very much focused on him being in a courtroom facing drug charges and not, opening big mainstream films. But, he did a lot before this to really make a comeback. I think that the two most notable films that he did just before Iron Man were Zodiac and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. In fact, Jon Favreau saw Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and really that was when he made the decision that he wanted Robert Downey Jr. to be Tony Stark, Iron Man. And Jon Favreau, funny enough, got this based off of his work with Zathura, which was kind of a Jumanji knockoff in space, I guess, is the best way to describe it. But Jon Favreau has, I think, garnered a reputation as being a very solid filmmaker with, he doesn't really have a distinct style, and I think that's probably a criticism of him. But when you look at his career, when you look at his filmography, he's definitely got a lot of credibility making films like Zathura and Iron Man and The Jungle Book. We're just going to pretend that Aliens versus Cowboys never happened, if that's okay with you.
Oh God, don't remind me of that one. But yeah, I get what you're saying on the whole style thing. I don't see it much as a criticism. I think it's more of like an adaptability. He can adapt to, certain situations. You look at the situation with Jungle Book where he was just working with no one and a kid, and just like the way that the story came out. And I was kind of skeptical about the whole CGI thing with the animals, but he pulled it off. He knows how to work with the CGI and actors and kind of combine them, and you can see how that kind of plays into Iron Man. A lot of it is, more towards the end is the CGI and stuff, but the way he incorporates it with Robert Downey Jr.'s performance, and then I guess was it his idea to do the thing where we see inside of his suit? I'm assuming that's got to be his idea. To me, that's kind of like some breakthrough kind of filmmaking right there, because you never really see that kind of perspective from a superhero. You know what I mean? And to see it through his eyes, and you got the voice coming through. You kind of get that somewhat like with the cartoon of the Iron Man back in the day. I've seen some of the episodes of the cartoon when I was a kid, but I thought Jon Favreau's direction and the way he interpreted the character, especially like, man, that opening scene where, he's just being cocky. It sets the tone for the character, him being in the car and just drinking with the military openly and taking pictures and stuff. And he had a great performance overall in this movie. I remember as a kid, too, the same thing with him being in the courtroom and stuff. And I remember telling my mom, like, I'm going to go watch Iron Man with my friends, and Robert Downey Jr.'s in it. He's Iron Man. She's like, Robert Downey Jr.? Isn't he on drugs? I remember he was always on drugs. And, yeah, I was like, yeah, he's not on drugs anymore. He's still funny. Yeah, and 10 years later, my mom's like, I can't believe he's so rich now, and blah, blah, blah. And he was always on drugs. That's how my mom remembered him.
So just for our posterity, this is the IMDb discussion of the plot. After being held captive in an Afghan cave, billionaire engineer Tony Stark creates a unique weaponized suit of armor to fight evil, and that's a pretty accurate description, I would say. Iron Man is a legacy character who was around for a number of years, and this is kind of the start of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Marvel, at a certain point in the 1990s, had to give up some of their characters just so they could stay alive. But after seeing the success of so many films like X-Men and Spider-Man, it was only natural that Marvel would decide that they had to do something on their own. So they decided to sign a distribution deal with Paramount, and Paramount released a number of these Marvel Cinematic Universe films, especially in the early going, before Disney deal. And this is the very first MCU. It's pretty amazing. I think 10 years later, I think you almost lose the perspective. I mean, it's Iron Man. It's not one of the major characters. It's also the Avengers. I don't think the Avengers are as highly regarded as the Justice League or the X-Men. They're kind of a B squad. And now I think if you were to talk to people, I think they would almost see the Justice League and the X-Men as kind of the B squad, and the Avengers are kind of the A-team. I mean, is there a comic book movie that's been more anticipated ever than Avengers Infinity War?
I don't think so. Maybe the third Dark Knight movie, but I remember that just being the hype because of the 4-year gap. But yeah, this is probably the most anticipated one. You got to give credit where credit's due. They invested in the story, and they knew that if they can get the character over with the story, and you slowly build these characters over time, you're going to build that fan base. And they did the groundwork. They went from nothing, and now they're on top. And you got to give them credit for that. They invested a lot. They took chances. And now it's going to pay off. And now we're in that transitional stage. We've been in, 3 phases, correct?
Yeah,
and this is going to be the start of phase 4.
And I don't think people realize just how big of a risk this was, not just because it was Robert Downey Jr., but because it was Iron Man. And I think that this film works on a number of levels. I think the performances from Robert Downey Jr., from Gwyneth Paltrow, they are very, very good. And I think that's where it starts for me, is their relationship. If their relationship doesn't work, then the rest of the film is just going to falter. And, even though he does not play a big role, Yinsen, that character, really does a lot to bring some heart into this and serves as a nice bridge between the first half of the film, kind of Act 1, and then getting into Act 2. So I think Yinsen is a really important character. It's funny, I'm not sure that Terrence Howard and Robert Downey Jr. had all that great a chemistry. I mean, there were some good quips in there, but I've always been a bigger fan of Don Cheadle, just from an acting point of view. I think Don Cheadle's a much better performer as far as that goes. Terrence Howard, from a physicality standpoint, probably would have been a better War Machine, but I think they kind of lucked out by getting Don Cheadle for Iron Man 2 and some of the other MCU films.
Totally agree. Like, Terrence Howard came off kind of stiff sometimes in some of the scenes. Like, he seems like he's got this serious tone to him, and then when Don Cheadle came in, it was like a shift. He was serious, but he can crack jokes. He's a guy you can go out drinking with. Tony Stark is a guy that if you're going to hang out with him, you're going to go drinking, you're going to have some fun and partying. Don Cheadle's, the way he interpreted that character in the second one, definitely you get that feel to him. Like here, Terrence Howard is very much a strict, straightforward guy, you know, teaching the young recruits, blah, blah, blah. The only good scene I think they had together was the plane scene, because that was when Terrence Howard was playing like he was drunk, and, you know, they were having some fun on the plane. But everything else after that was pretty kind of stiff, in my opinion, of his performance. And then you kind of feel bad, because he looks at the prototype for the War Machine suit and is like, next time, baby. And there ain't going to be no next time for that, because he didn't play the role. So that kind of sucks. But yeah, Don Cheadle, I think, was a better choice overall. I still think that Terrence Howard did a decent enough job to get Tony motivated in some of the scenes, and he did have some heartfelt moments. Had Don Cheadle been originally cast in this, I think it would have been even better.
Yeah, it certainly would have made the continuity much better. But I do think we need to talk about the specific chemistry between Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow, because, like I said earlier, I think it really makes the film function. It really puts a lot of heart into it. And I think when we start talking about some of the future MCU movies, I think that this is actually kind of a weakness of a lot of the MCU movies, is there really isn't that much chemistry in a lot of them between kind of your main superhero and whomever his love interest is. You obviously get that in Iron Man. I think you get that to a little bit of a lesser extent in Captain America, with Haley Atwell and Chris Evans, but it's really hard to really to really see this in some of the other MCU films. I know that Natalie Portman plays a big role in the first two Thors, but I was never particularly impressed with her chemistry with Chris Hemsworth. Even though I like both of them individually, I'm not sure that the sparks were ever really flying for those two. But I mean, these two, just from the first scene, I mean, just it's really impressive to just see these two just click, and the dialogue is very fast, and from what I understand, there was a lot of improvisation, and I think you can feel that at times, and I think that's why this first one, even though there is a plot, it's very, very loose at times, and some of the dialogue is very loose, and I think that's another thing that separates this from so many of the MCU movies, is that it does not feel bloated, it does not feel like there's a million different things going on. And I think one of the weaknesses of both Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3, it really felt like those movies were so overstuffed that they really couldn't focus on anything. In this one, you really kind of get a sense of who Iron Man is. You get a sense of who Tony Stark is right from the start, and you see him building the suit. I always think that's really cool in superhero movies, to like actually watching them build the suit and develop their skills and train. You know, Tony Stark does not always have success when he's Iron Man. And, you know, he has trouble, you know, flying off the ground. He has that problem when he flies all the way into space, and he has the icing problem, which actually becomes important in the third act. So I think that's a really cool thing. And like I said, just everything about this, I think, from a story standpoint, especially in the first 90 minutes, I think it really works.
Definitely. It's got that old school, like, Cary Grant kind of feel to him. You know what I mean? Like when they're having their romantic moments with him and Gwyneth Paltrow, it almost feels like you're watching like a 50s, 40s movie kind of thing, where like they're just the two main characters are trying to charm the shit out of each other to the point where they can't take it anymore. And it kind of builds up, and then it kind of leads and builds up to that scene where they're almost about to kiss on the roof at that party, and then they ask for a drink, and then they separate. That's totally, like, that had that old school movie kind of feel to me. I love that kind of classic movie feel, where you just focus on two main characters, and they're just trying to, like, charm the shit out of each other, like I said. And that was, like, that's the chemistry that they have, and it works so well. I think Gwyneth Paltrow's performance actually gets better in 2 and 3, sort of, and just hear me out, because I feel like she kind of takes control of the company, of Tony. She's running things. She's more like a strong female kind of character. In this one, she's more of that, what do you call it, submissive, because she's the assistant to Tony. It's her boss. she's conflicted kind of thing. And it still works in this movie, especially, you know, when they're, like I said, in that scene where she's got wearing the dress and like, I've never seen you wear that dress before. You bought it for me. I did. Yeah. Happy birthday. They just, you know, the dialogue works so well. But then 2 and 3, I guess, because she, you know, she's more in control. She's very strong-willed in 2 and 3. I like her more in those in terms of the performance because she's like a stronger character. But the chemistry's still there. And we even see that brief moment of chemistry again in Spider-Man Homecoming when she makes that cameo. So I think they got to go back to that a little bit.
Homecoming.
Oh, come on. 7 months, people. If you haven't watched it by now, you shouldn't be listening to this podcast. But anyway, yeah, their chemistry works so well. It's old school. And, yeah, I think it works really well. And Tony Stark, again, just the way he's performing. And, you know, you get this kind of vibe, too, that, like, this is also kind of like a subtle kind of, like, message of, like, a guy going through a midlife crisis, literally, but, like, in the most extreme conditions. Like, he's going through it all of a sudden, a midlife crisis in a cave, and he's, like, borderline death kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, he just changes his ways and his philosophy, and all of a sudden, he's a new man. In terms of that, I thought it was kind of, you know, a guy reflecting on what his life was, and now halfway through his life, he wants to change. And that kind of sets the tone for the whole Marvel Universe, I think, because a lot of Tony's actions, what he does, it reflects in the other movies. Like, you know, Ultron, I think, is key to the entire next 5 years because everything is based on what happens in Age of Ultron. I mean, Age of Ultron, we're still feeling the effects of it because we didn't see Hulk since Age of Ultron. And all of a sudden, we see him recently, like 3 months ago, spoiler alert, in Thor. You know what I mean? So, like, it's all because of Tony Stark, and everything is because of him. Him in the cave with that Jensen character, I love that stuff because Jensen is like condescending to him, but he's being like a dick to him, but he's trying to teach him when he's interpreting for the guys, the terrorists who kept him and Tony captive. He's like, they call Tony Stark the great American killer, or the greatest killer in American history, you know, and he says it with like this tone, and it's just like, whoa, this is what I've become. Like, I didn't realize that my weapons were doing this to people, and it's hurting the good and the bad, you know what I mean? And especially when he realizes that his own, you know, weapons are being used against him, you know, and then, of course, that leads into the whole plot with the villain. But, yeah, Tony Stark and that first half is just, it's fantastic, that first half. Him in Afghanistan and learning about himself, changing, and it's definitely a deep performance.
I think the story is a little bit more than just Iron Man taking on another Iron Man, which is what it feels like the second and third one. All three of these movies, it's kind of Iron Man versus other Iron Men, or some version of that. And even the third act of this has it, which I think has contributed to some of the problems. When it comes to Gwyneth Paltrow, that is something that I'm going to be watching out for. It's not something that I've really noticed, and I'll be really honest, I have not watched Iron Man 3 since I saw it in theaters, because I just really wasn't a big fan. I have watched Iron Man 2 maybe once or twice, but I will pay attention specifically for that when we get to those two particular movies. Something else that I want to discuss as we kind of transition, we've talked about kind of the heroes, but I do think we have to talk about the villains. And there are two things about this film that I don't think have aged very well. And the first one is all the stuff with Christine Everhart, who is the journalist. One of my least favorite tropes in all films, not just superhero films, but in all films, is when the female journalist sleeps with her subject. And that is exactly what happens here. And then Gwyneth Paltrow's character, Pepper Potts, slut-shames her immediately after the fact. So I wasn't too big of a fan of that. And there is also the generic evil Arabs, which I'm not a tremendous fan of in this particular film. So I'm not sure really how that stuff ages, but I definitely think that it is worth mentioning and worth discussing.
Yeah, I get that same vibe too. In terms of the Afghani terrorists, I guess because 2008, it's still relatively close to that time frame of, you know, the whole war in the Middle East, and we're kind of still in the middle. We're still in that war. I mean, it never ended. It's just kind of been shoved under the rug a little bit, I think, in terms of the media. But yeah, it does contribute to, I think, a lot of stereotypes, and that was one thing I got when I first watched the movie. I was like, man, why do they have to be like Afghan terrorists? But, you know, I get it. It's, you know, they're trying to be relevant. I can't even remember in the original comic, I don't even know who kidnapped him or what the actual origin story was, to be honest, because I only read a certain amount of comics. I mean, graphic novels. I had never read any Iron Man stuff. I read some Avengers stuff, but never any Iron Man. So I don't even know where he really was, in what cave and what part of the country or whatever. But they could have easily just did maybe like a European country and just kept them, I don't know, under wraps. But I guess they wanted that feel of the desert as well, because that visual of him in the desert, with the Iron Man stuff or the suit and everything, and him walking through the desert, that does look really awesome in some of those shots. So I kind of see why they chose that locale. But it is kind of like, man, you're just contributing to stereotypes too, and the whole slut shaming thing. It's very true, and I don't think that would fly in the Marvel movies today. You kind of get that opposite effect with Amy Adams, but she does end up sleeping with her subject anyway because it's Superman. But I think they kind of saw that and they try to fix that in some of maybe the DC movies with Amy Adams. That's why they picked Amy Adams to be a stronger female character. But yeah. The whole trope of the journalist thing, sleeping with the subject, it's been done. And this was 2008, so things have changed. And especially now in this culture, we're just more woke.
Much more aware of kind of the issues that, what slut-shaming is, and maybe we shouldn't have movies that are dealing with stereotypes, like having the random evil, generic Arabs fighting against the superheroes. So for me, I think it really hurts the villain score. And of course, we do have to talk about the main villain played by Jeff Bridges. That would be Obadiah Slane. There was originally supposed to be a connection to Mandarin, and there was even some talk that Slane would not be revealed as a villain until Iron Man 2, but ultimately he becomes the main villain here. And I think Jeff Bridges is always going to be known for playing the dude in The Big Lebowski, and it's really hard not to see him playing that. And even in so many of the roles that he has played since then, he is playing some version of the relaxed dude. And here he is just playing something very different. He's bald. He is playing kind of the evil villain. And I think it works at some points, and other points it doesn't. I think, when we get to the story in just a couple minutes, I think we'll talk about where it doesn't. But I think he is a really good person to play off of Robert Downey Jr., because regardless of the problems that Robert Downey Jr. has had, there was never any question about his ability as an actor and some of the things that he had done previous to his drug problems. But Jeff Bridges was somebody who was very good, a very credible person to include as one of the major villains. And even though I'm not ultimately a fan of how it pays off, I think he does a great job of kind of playing both sides, and kind of I guess it's kind of predictable that he is ultimately the villain, but he does a very good job of kind of not really playing his hand until he needs to.
Yeah, it's very subtle, I guess, because he's very monotone throughout the whole movie, and I feel like, yeah, there was a lot of scenes where it plays well when he's talking to Tony, being that father figure to him, being like that shoulder to cry on, to lean on, especially when he comes back from the ordeal of being in the desert and being captive. But then I feel like the times when he's trying to be the evil villain, he's still got that monotone, and it doesn't click. Like when he's talking to Tony, when he paralyzes Tony and he's taking out his heart, it plays well, but then you feel like, man, I feel like Jeff Bridges underperformed those parts where he's supposed to be this evil dude, and he could have played that up a little bit more, I think. But he just said that one monotone. He only yells with very little towards the end of the movie, I think, when he's in the big suit.
He gets into the suit, and then that's when he is kind of almost going the complete opposite direction, and overacting, and almost playing against the character that he's played for the previous 90 minutes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big weaknesses of this movie, is just the way that, I don't know if it was Jon Favreau's choice to direct him that way. I don't know if Jeff Bridges was just in it for the money, because, I mean, yeah, those scenes were good with Tony. It's just human to human, but him as a villain, it doesn't click in this movie for me. For him to be
cliches. And to be fair, I think that this is something that a lot of Marvel movies have had, and even a lot of the DC movies have had. I mean, as good as Wonder Woman is, even Wonder Woman does not have the best third act ever. But I will say that the biggest difference between this film and even some of the DC ones is that, we get a really good first 90 minutes, and I think that we also get a really good clincher at the end when Robert Downey Jr. says, "I am Iron Man." Apparently, this is something that Kevin Feige is a really big believer of. He's a big believer in the idea that secret identities are kind of pointless and not really something that you can build films around in the year 2018 and even a little bit before that. So that's why you really don't have the quote-unquote secret identity of these characters, as it's never really been a plot point in any of the superhero movies. And even Aunt May finds out that Peter Parker is Spider-Man at the end of Homecoming. So even with that film, that franchise is going to change a little bit, because Aunt May is going to know who Spider-Man is, and that will probably change the dynamics in a positive.
It kind of sets this tone in Iron Man 2, where it's like everyone knows who he is now, and that kind of plays into the plot. And so he becomes like this target, yet he's like the most feared person on the planet kind of thing. That kind of made the dynamic interesting in Iron Man 2. Despite all the flaws in Iron Man 2, that was, I thought, one of the interesting parts of it, that, they go away from that trope of, hiding the identity, and it's obvious that it's him now, and he's the face of the company, so it creates this problem, which they talk about in Iron Man 2. I thought it was just bold. No other superhero movie had done that at that point, I don't think, where it just reveals to the world that he's Iron Man, and then that's how the movie ends, kind of thing. Or not ends, quote unquote. There's a bigger scene we're going to talk about in a second, but
when we get to Legacy, I think we will address the big post-credit scene. I think that's really the best place to talk.
It's just so strange to see that. When I didn't expect that to happen at the end, because it looked like he was about to say something, I don't know, like a joke or something, and then he just says it, and then they're like, what? And then it goes, and then the music cue, right? And then that was the perfect music cue. Right. So it all kind of clicks at the end.
Ending to a Marvel movie ever.
I'll have to think about that one, but I get what you're saying, because it really just like, wow, that like it sets this like, wow, exclamation points at the end.
It's going to be very different. I mean, because almost every other superhero movie up to this point has relied to some extent on the idea of the secret identity. It's something we saw in Superman. It's something that we saw in Batman. Even to X-Men, to a certain extent, they're trying to hide who they are and not really being true to themselves. But here, it just right away establishes Tony Stark is not going to be pretending that he's anything but Iron Man. And even in the future movies, everybody knows who Captain America is. Everybody knows who Thor is. And I think it's kind of freshened things up a little bit. And it's opened up the kind of stories that you can tell as well. And when we talk about the story, like I said, this to me reminded me a lot of Batman Begins in spirit. Just the way that we start in one place, then we flash back a little bit, and we see Tony Stark building his suit and kind of developing the character, quote unquote, the suit, and just everything that goes with it. And we get to see him really building, and we get to see just how intelligent he is, how smart he is. And there's a lot of show don't tell, which I'm a big fan of in this, that he's not telling you how smart he is, but he's showing you just in his ability to navigate technology, to become Iron Man, and to be able to build this suit that is ultimately going to be unstoppable, and to build multiple arc reactors as well. Those are a huge part of this first film and would play on later as well. But what happens in the end is we get Iron Man versus Jeff Bridges, Slane's Iron Man, and it was just two CGI Iron Mans just kind of punching each other for a little while until the real Iron Man wins. And yeah, I think the story for the first 90 minutes is really good, and then it just kind of becomes a checklist in Act 3. So I think the story is very good for 2/3, but not as great in the final third.
I agree, except the last 5-10 minutes, or maybe let the last 5 minutes, goes back to what it was. That's why it gives us that exclamation point kind of ending. So it kind of goes back to that. But yeah, I mean, I think it would have been better if they would have just revealed that Jeff Bridges was the villain, like at the start, maybe. Because then, like, the reveal is not even that big. It's just like it's so obvious, right?
Right.
If they would have just done it at the start, I think it would have added this heightened tension in their scenes. It's like, okay, so Alfred Hitchcock, right? He always said that, like, if you're going to film a scene of people eating breakfast, right, what's the point? Tell the audience that there's a bomb under the table that's going to go off in 15 minutes and play the same scene. So I think if you would have known that he was the villain, and Tony doesn't know, it creates this, psychological thing going on, which I think would have heightened the performances a little bit. But because they went to the traditional route, and we had to reveal the guy halfway through, or not even halfway through, it was like 2/3 through. Yeah, I just feel like that was one of the weaknesses. It was definitely the villain, how they treated it. It was like there was two villains, and they kind of set you up thinking that the main terrorist guy was the main villain, and then all of a sudden it became Ebediah or whatever. I thought that was kind of weak writing right there. They should have just established, Jeff Bridges as the guy who's the villain behind this all, and heightens the tension on the other scenes.
Right. It was supposed to be Raza for almost the first hour, and then Slane has that scene with him where he basically kills him, and then we kind of go from there. Let's talk about the visuals. I think that one of the things that Marvel, on the plus side, I think what Marvel does do is they kind of bring back the brightly lit costumes back. Iron Man is red and yellow, and it's really not muted. A lot of the Marvel films take place in daylight, which is very helpful because we can actually see everything. And, I think this is something that comes through in a lot of MCU movies, that it does take place in daylight, that it is very brightly lit, that they're not trying to mute everything down to a point where you can barely see what's going on. Whereas, on the other hand, from a visual standpoint, there are very few Marvel movies that really stand out for me as far as this is a true, visual artist at work. I don't think you really get that with a lot of these. I think Thor Ragnarok and Black Panther have gone a long way in kind of changing that perception, but especially even when you watch a movie like Civil War, the look of that film is very indistinguishable almost from any of the other Marvel movies. And obviously, a part of that is by design because of the way that it works with the directors, is you want to have these directors kind of be able to just come in and fit in to what Marvel is already doing, but at certain times it is a little bit frustrating to watch these movies and they kind of all run together from a visual standpoint.
I guess the only exception would be Guardians, because I felt Guardians 1 especially really stands out to me visually. But that's because it's like the sci-fi, right? That's the first one that goes really truly sci-fi.
It's the first cosmic adventure.
Yeah, exactly. But before that, yeah, I totally agree. It's got the same look, but I think it's because they wanted to make it like a seamless kind of universe. It wants you to make you feel like this is all the same universe, so it's got to have the same look, which is totally understandable. I love the fact that they brought the colors back. In terms of the visual effects, I didn't know how they were going to pull off a suit. At first, I thought they were going to do a real suit, maybe, because I heard about Iron Man a year before, right? And Transformers just came out, and I was blown away. Man, as bad as Transformers is, the visuals was holy shit, they actually did a Transformers where they transform, and it looked like actual machinery and stuff. So I was like, wow, is this how they're going to do Iron Man? Or are they going to do a real suit? And then at first I think they actually build the suit in the cave, which I love because it gives it that actual feel, that actual gritty look to it. And then when they go to the CGI suit, I was how are they going to pull this off? And then as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh, I think they contacted ILM, right?
Yes.
That's the number one go-to.
Sound on Skywalker Sound, and again, this is even before the Disney deal, but they did work with ILM and they used Skywalker Sound.
Yeah, and that's the same company that the Transformers, and you can tell it's the same style, but I just feel like ILM just bust their ass every time in every movie they do, and they just blow it out of the water kind of thing. And I was just blown away at how they just made it seem seamless. There's so much detail on the CGI in the suit that it doesn't get appreciated enough, I feel especially those moments where you just look inside the suit and there's all this detail and stuff, and it's holy shit, it doesn't get enough love, I feel. The suit and the way they designed it and the way that they animated CGI, it doesn't get enough love, I feel.
I can certainly understand. I mean, like I said, from a visual standpoint, I certainly think there are positives, there are definitely negatives, but I think it's worth kind of putting all of that into perspective. When we talk about the legacy of this movie, Brian, it's almost too obvious. It literally starts 10 years of huge, big-budget films to the point where the MCU really drives the box office at this point. And you look at what Marvel has been able to do. This is the brand that has literally gotten people to go see a movie with a talking tree and a talking raccoon in it. This is a franchise this is the studio that has put forth one of the most important superhero movies of 2018, and that would be Black Panther, which is going to really bring representation to the screen. And you look at everything else that they've done for so many of the actors, Chris Evans, Chris Hemsworth, Chris Pratt, really making them into huge superstars. And this is kind of where it all started, and really it all started, kind of the thesis of this whole project comes in the post-credits sequence when we see Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury talking to Tony Stark about there being other superheroes and mentioning the Avengers project. And at that time, it was a pipe dream, and it wasn't something that even seemed realistic. But, just 4 years later, we had an Avengers film, and we're going to be talking about that particular film, and not just in a few weeks. And, just the way that they were able to do it by having the Captain America, the Thor, the Hulk, the Iron Man, and then all of those films kind of came together with the Avengers. And the legacy of this film is undisputed as far as that goes. Brian, I know that you kind of want to ding this film a little bit for legacy, and I'm going to let you do that, because I usually have the reputation for being the negative one. So I'm going to let you take that mantle this time.
Yeah, let's talk about that first, because it connects with the villains, right? Like, it sets this tone where the villain is not the strong villain that we deserve, in a movie like this. It sets this tone where, like, all future Marvel movies have a weak villain, and it sets precedent here. And I feel like that kind of overall takes away from the legacy, because it creates this negative for the future movies. But that's my only gripe, because it sets this tone for like a weak villain that's not really written too well up until we get like Loki, I think, which is like a couple movies later. And Loki wasn't even fully realized, I feel, until Avengers, because he was the villain in Thor 1, but it still had that weakness to it. He wasn't as a strong villain, but he gets to be like that badass villain that we all know he is in Avengers. But it just takes a while for the movies to get a good villain. I mean, Iron Man 2 had a crappy villain. And then Thor, like I said, after that, and then Red Skull was kind of like a step up, but they killed him off immediately, and they didn't even give him enough time to like develop, I feel. And then after one movie, he was gone. So yeah, and then not until Loki. So it sets this precedent of like weak villains. But other than that, that's the only like negative I have on the legacy. Other than that, I remember being in the theater and everyone around me telling me, "You got to stay. There's an after credit scene." I'm like, "What's an after credit scene?" Like the ones on those DVD, like I see on DVD sometimes that people forget about. Like, yeah, you got to stay. It's really important. And everyone around us was telling us to stay. And we're like, okay, so we wait. All of a sudden, we see Samuel L. Jackson with a fucking eye patch, and we're like, what the fuck? And then he does the speech, and then the whole audience just loses their that was one of the biggest pops. You know what I mean? Like, and I had no idea, like, what they were trying to build. I thought it was just the one movie that they were going to do, maybe 2 and 3, like their own Iron Man trilogy, but I was like, they're going to build a universe? And then, okay, the other thing was Incredible Hulk came out a year or two, right? Despite how bad that movie was, they still tried to connect the universes, even though that one scene where Tony Stark is in Incredible Hulk, they kind of retconned that, and I think they deleted that from the history. Because the timeline doesn't work out after that point. But it gave you this feel like, holy shit, like, they're building a universe? Like, with all the other characters, and then when you found out that they were at Thor in development, Captain America in development, Iron Man 2 in development, and then Avengers, like, in 4 years, we were just like, what the fuck? No one had ever tried that before. And then that's the legacy, that one scene. If that one scene was not there, like, there would have been no hype, I think, for as much hype for Iron Man 2. Because I think a lot of the hype going into Iron Man 2 was like, oh my god, like, the Avengers. It's got to be about the Avengers, right? They got to start the Avengers. And like, that's what everyone wanted at Iron Man 2, and we kind of got glimpses of that. And then when they finally started building it with Captain America and Thor, you know, that's when everyone realized, wow, like, this is going to be big once Avengers comes out. And Avengers comes out, it's fucking huge. They set the tone, and they set, like, they started small. They started from the ground up, and with that one scene, like, it kind of just elevated their universe to this whole other level with that one scene. And now it's come to the point where people are literally staying at tentpole movies after the credits, or maybe not just tentpole, like comic book movies. Some other tentpole movies do that too now. But you stay, thinking that there's going to be a scene after the credits. Like, it's become this thing, like this cultural phenomenon of staying after the credits, right? That might, like, it started here. Other movies did before, but Iron Man really took it to that next level. And now every Marvel movie, you got to wait, because there's after credit scenes, there's mid credit scenes. Like, no other movies have done that, and it creates this extra like element to it, and then it kind of teases you for the next one and keeps you excited even more and more. It teases you, and they get it, man. They get it, and even in DC movies, they stole that too. So that's, I think, a big part of the legacy of what audience and moviegoers are doing now, literally staying after the credits, all because of this one movie that did it first, and all of a sudden, all other comic movies have to do the same thing, and now you're thinking that there's a scene after the credits.
Right, and I think what's so interesting about that is right now, I think I almost wonder if Marvel feels trapped in the fact that they have to do these after credit sequences, because I almost think that maybe they don't want to do them all the time, and now they kind of feel a responsibility. It's like, well, what are we going to include in this post-credit sequence? So I almost wonder if it's like a crutch or a burden for them at this point, and if it's something that's going to stop at some point, or if they're going to kind of change how they do it. But it is certainly an important legacy to this film. Brian, what I want to do right now, I always ask some burning questions. So let's go to the first one here. Is Robert Downey Jr.'s casting the most important moment in Marvel Studios history?
Yeah, I mean, everything starts with him. He got the ball rolling. If it wasn't for his performance, we wouldn't have the Marvel universe as it is today. It would probably just be, if it wasn't as good as it was, the movie probably wouldn't have made as much money. We probably would have got the Iron Man 2. It probably would have ignored the whole Avengers thing. We would just got Iron Man movies. But because of him, he just pulled it off, man. Credit to him for investing in himself. Because, like we said, he took less money, knowing that the studio didn't really trust them. And with his reputation, who wouldn't? Credit to him for just banking on himself and being a smart businessman afterward and doing the Jack Nicholson thing and getting the great deal. And now he's just...
The Godfather $50 million for being in 5 Marvel movies.
Yeah, tremendous. At this point, I think it's like more, actually. But,
of course.
But yeah.
He's certainly made a few fortunes off of these Marvel films, and we'll probably continue to do so, at least for the next couple here. Was Jeff Bridges the best choice to play Obadiah Slane?
No, I think because of his performance, like, you could have just put any actor at his level and it would have came out the same if you were going to direct that character like that. He didn't really have a lot to do, you know what I mean? Like, he was just going to be subtle and kind of a dick to Tony at times, and that's kind of it. And then he had to overact it. You could have done that with anyone. You could have put in... Shoot, let me think of a random name. Mark Strong. That would have been better, I think, actually.
That's a very interesting one. Yeah, I don't know. It's just Jeff Bridges in this role just really didn't click for me, and I almost wonder if they would have done a better casting job with this now than in 2008, because I know that they had to feel that getting someone like Jeff Bridges involved would have been important.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, the legacy of the dude, everything he's done since being the Big Lebowski, it's just been him being partly the dude. Even in, you go look at True Grit, even though he's playing, the John Wayne kind of thing going on with Rooster Cogburn or whatever his name was.
He's still the dude.
He's still the dude, yeah. I think, okay, this is going to sound crazy, but I think Jeff Bridges gave a better performance in the 1976 King Kong than in Iron Man. And that's a shoot.
I don't think I've ever seen the 1976 version of King Kong, and I don't find myself feeling inspired enough to watch it. Why would I watch the 1976 version? There's like 3 other versions I could watch.
I was a kid. I was like, oh, King Kong in color or King Kong in black and white? I'll go with the color one.
Well, now you've smartened up and hopefully realized that you should watch it in black and white.
Absolutely. That's the only one out of the 2. That's the one I have on Blu-ray.
And that is a heavy shot at Peter Jackson's 3-hour opus, King Kong. It has its moments, but it's way too long.
That's for sure.
Does Gwyneth Paltrow get enough credit for her performances as Pepper?
No, and I think once you see what I'm seeing in 2 and 3 of how she's more of a stronger female character, I think you'll give her more credit, because I give her a lot of credit for being in all these sequels and being as, I mean, despite how you feel about her personal life and the weird stuff she does with nature products and whatever that brand she has of hers.
Is what I call it. And
yeah,
think that
let's call it that.
That has had an adverse effect on how people perceive her.
Right, and now she's become this side character whenever she, decides to show up. I mean, the last time she was in a Marvel movie was Iron Man 3, and then she showed up in Spider-Man Homecoming, 4 years later. Yeah, I mean, credit to her for, sticking to it. She could probably be doing other things, but probably the money she's being offered, good for her. And credit to her for, she's the one that keeps Tony in check. And that's what I love about that character. Every time Tony tries to do, something reckless or whatever, she's there to keep him in check. And you always need that character to keep Tony in check.
Would Terrence Howard have made a good war machine?
Man, I don't know. You need some humor, and Don Cheadle gave it that humor, so I gotta say no. I'm kind of glad that he didn't end up being the war machine in Iron Man 2 and 3, because Don Cheadle was just so much better. He's so much more entertaining. I mean, Terrence Howard, yeah, he got nominated for Hustle and Flow and all that, and that was a big deal back in the day, I remember, and him getting that nomination got him the job here. But at the same time, that role of Rhodey is supposed to be like a buddy to Tony, and here he's just kind of like trying to be like his babysitter, basically, and that's kind of not the vibe that you get from Don Cheadle. So,
right. Was there a way to bring Mandarin into the MCU without being problematic? Because Mandarin was supposed to play a role in the first Iron Man. He would play a role in the third Iron Man. And I'm just curious to hear what your opinion is on this.
Yeah, I think you have to bring the character into the universe because he's a quintessential character to the Iron Man comics and whatever. But I mean, there was no other way of getting around the controversy of, as stereotypical Asian as the evil villain. But then they switched it up and hired Ben Kingsley, so then it became this whitewashing thing, which kind of made it even worse, I think. But at the same time, it turned out to be like this fake actor. And then, I don't know if you know, but there's an actual Mandarin still on the loose in the Marvel Universe. There's the secret deleted scene, I think on the Iron Man 3 Blu-ray, where they reveal that Mandarin is an actual Mandarin out there. So that's probably, I think it's not going to be into play anymore because the universe is so above that now, where the Mandarin was probably insignificant in terms of the safety of the Earth compared to Thanos. So I think they're going to sweep that under the rug. But I don't know. I just feel like you could have just introduced them maybe as a minor character and not a major one. But overall, there's no way of getting around the controversy because of the race relations surrounding that one, especially, and then after hiring Ben Kingsley to play the role. So that kind of made things worse.
Let's get to our scores now for Iron Man, the original 2008. As we go first to Heroes.
Gotta give it a 9. I would give it a 10, except for he's not the wholesome guy. You know what I mean? He's not a wholesome guy. But I don't know if that's a negative or positive, but he does have his flaws, and they don't address the issue of him being an alcoholic, kind of.
Kind of.
They never outright say it. The thing is, there is a comic of Tony Stark dealing with his alcohol. I forget what it's called, but it's he's dealing with his demons or whatever it's called. But they don't really address it as an issue, even though it kind of becomes an issue in 2, less 3, but definitely 2. But yeah, that's kind of a flaw in his character, I think, that they don't address and they should address. I think that would have made him more of a relatable character, so I'll give it a 9.
I think a 9 is perfect because I think you really get, Tony Stark is great, Pepper Potts is great, Rhodey probably not as great of a character as he should have been, but as far as really establishing a character, you really can't do much better than this. And tons of credit to Jon Favreau and Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow for really, putting this all together. Villains, out of 10, I gave this a 7, and I almost feel like I'm giving this too much credit, but I did like some of the elements of the first 90 minutes as far as... I almost think this is more of a credit to how good Iron Man is as a character than to the actual villains.
Yeah, I give it a 7 too. We criticized it already. It's a weak villain. Jeff Bridges underdelivers. there is kind of that red herring of who the actual villain is, and then with the reveal. But he does have his good moments. Like, I do like those small moments where he's just talking to Tony, like, next, I'm glad you're back. How you feeling? Being that father figure. But then it kind of goes off the rails a little bit when he's in the suit, being over the top. So I almost gave it a 6. But it's just hard to, lower Jeff Bridges to that standard. But at the same time, like, I do give it a 7 because those scenes, like I said, him being the father figure to Tony really clicked for that small moment of the movie.
So for the story, I almost went with a 7. And that was actually, going into the film, this is about what I had it at, was at a 7. And then the final 5 minutes with the speech and him saying, I am Iron Man, I bumped it up to an 8 for that reason, so I give it an 8.
I go with a 9 because the stuff in the cave was just, that's how you create a driven character that's motivated. And then I love that moment where Jensen is dying and Tony's like, we got to get you out of here. And then he's like, don't waste your life or whatever. He says, you're talented, he's basically saying, and, don't waste it. And that kind of becomes the motivation for Tony. You know what I mean? Like, he realizes that he has all this talent and he survives, and he could have been just another, he could have just made more weapons and have, weapons kill people, but he decided to make that change, So I think the story goes a long way. And especially that first half. And like I said, it's kind of this subtle thing of a guy going through a midlife crisis that I kind of saw in the recent viewing because halfway through his life, he changes everything. So I go with the 9.
Visuals, I gave a 7. I think that there are some positives, but like I said, I think the generic Marvel look has hurt things in some ways. I do appreciate the brightly lit aspects of it, but I think a 7 is about what all of the visuals for all the MCU movies are going to probably end up being. It's going to be either a 7. Guardians of the Galaxy might get a little bit higher, but yeah, this is about where I see it.
Man, this is where we're going to differ. I go a little higher. I go 9 because going in, it was hit or miss. Like, if that suit did not look the way it did, if it looked like, I don't know, like The Rock in The Mummy Returns, you know what I mean? Like, it would have not. You see what I'm saying? Like, it would not have had that feel to it. Like, if that suit didn't work, the whole movie doesn't work, right? And they made it work, and they made it look good, and they knew that, like, they had to get ILM, because ILM is the perfect company to do it. Thank God for them to making this suit look good, for sure. I do love the look. I love everything that's bright. I didn't like, towards the end, like, the visuals with, the arc reactor. That wasn't, I don't know. They come up with better visuals for, like, the arc reactor and all the technology stuff in the second one, third one. But they were kind of building towards that. And I did like this, like I said, him in the suit, and you see through the suit of what he sees. I thought that's creative stuff. Because now you see the suit on the outside, but when you get the scene on the inside, you still feel like it's Tony Stark and not some machine. So I give it a 9.
And the legacy, I am going to change mine from a 10 to a 9 just because I agree with you. I don't think the villains are all that great, and I think it kind of established that this legacy of villains not being nearly as great. But otherwise, it really doesn't get much better than this. I mean, this is pretty fantastic as far as establishing the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I think it functions exactly as it needs to. So I give this 8.
I give it a 9 as well. That was my only gripe, was the whole unintentional negative legacy, I guess you'd say, of having a weak villain, and it kind of takes away from the other movies as well by setting that precedent. But overall, man, just Iron Man sets the tone. The after credit scene, the look, the feel, the jokes, and then even in today's TV world, because you forget that S.H.I.E.L.D. debuted in this movie, and we never even talked about Coulson yet. But Coulson,
did not talk about Coulson, and we probably should
he's I don't know, 4 scenes, and he's just like very, like, you forget about him, and that's kind of the point. Because when they bring up S.H.I.E.L.D. again at the end, it's like, oh my God, that's what Coulson was. He was from S.H.I.E.L.D. the whole time, and we were just ignoring him, treating him like nothing. And the way that Potts and Tony just kind of like, we'll schedule a meeting later, leave me alone, blah blah blah. But yeah, and now we have a S.H.I.E.L.D. show that's been 5 seasons running, and I'm already like 2 seasons behind. But the legacy of this movie is like all over the place. Yeah, he is.
Not
I mean,
as good he definitely
too bad
grows
he
into
didn't
the role. I think I think by the time he gets to the Avengers, he's really, really good. But here, he's definitely not as great.
yeah, he didn't have much to play with. You know, they gave him, what, 4 lines, 5 lines?
Right.
And then all he had to do was explain the SHIELD acronym. I can't even tell you what the SHIELD acronym is, but certainly the legacy of this movie is in our current TV world. You know, and let's not forget, no Iron Man, no Marvel Netflix shows. So there.
Right. I mean, this really just establishes a number of different things and different directions Marvel can go into. As I do the math here, I come up with the number 40 as my overall total. What is your total?
Mine's 43.
Meaning that we have put our second film into the superhero pantheon. This has joined Superman in the superhero pantheon. So, just to recap, over the last 4 weeks, we have reviewed Superman, Batman, X-Men, and Iron Man. We put 2 out of the 4 in our superhero pantheon, which looks like Superman and Iron Man. So, I'm pretty satisfied with where we're at, 2 out of 4, and we're going to be going in a very different direction next week. Brian, why don't you tell the audience where it is we're going next week?
Well, I remember being 5 years old, going to the video store. No, wait a minute. I saw it in theaters. Scratch that. I remember going into the theater, and, like, my dad took me, and it was like, we're going to watch a superhero movie. His name was Meteor Man. And I was like Superman? Like, yeah. So we go in, and lo and behold, a black superhero in 1993. Robert Townsend, I'm a fan of his. I know people know him on, the WB network for the Parenthood. Or was it Parenthood? I think it was Parenthood. But he was on that for, what, a couple seasons, and that's kind of his lasting legacy. But I remember him. I saw a movie in college called Hollywood Shuffle. Really opened my eyes to diversity in film and independent filmmaking as a whole. And then I put 2 and 2 together and realized later on in life that, like, Meteor Man, that's Robert Townsend. And Meteor Man is just way ahead of its time. I feel like it's the perfect moment or perfect time to watch it, revisit it, especially with Black Panther coming out. People forget that. I'm looking back at history. Blade is 1998. Meteor Man is 93. Meteor Man might be the first black superhero in the main role in any movie released in theaters. I got to do more research. I've been doing research. I'm not counting, like, blaxploitation films like Shaft. I'm not counting like Last Dragon, even though that's got some superhero stuff to it.
Basically,
yeah,
this has the list of black superhero movies. We're talking Meteor Man, Spawn, and The Blades. And if you want to count Hancock with Will Smith, that's about it.
God, I forgot about Hancock. Good Lord. Holy shit.
That came out the same year as Iron Man and The Dark Knight.
Wow. Okay. So,
Right?
yeah, we might talk about that one soon, too. I mean, I forget that he's even a hero in that movie. I mean, he's an anti-hero, I guess, but